So last week we did panoramas, and I used these 3 images in red to do my panorama. I did shoot this with brackets, and so now I'm going to come back and revisit this panorama as an HDR panorama. So I'm going to use multiple exposures from each of these 3 shots for the panorama to create HDR, or high dynamic range. So I'm going to choose the darkest one because I want to keep all this bright detail that's up in the sky, the one that we used last time, and the brightest on all 3 of my panoramic exposures. And then I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to say Photo Merge HDR Panorama. And it's going to draw the preview of my panorama. And I have the ability to select my projection. Perspective is fine because I did this with the shift lens, and so I'm not worried about any of those changes. I'm going to auto crop it and auto settings on it and have it sort of get me started. It's telling me down here that if I need to do de-ghosting on my HDRs, which is where something is moving in the image and I want to take care of that in the HDR, then what I need to do is pre-create an HDR for each segment of the panorama and then merge them as a panorama. Because when we do it as an HDR panorama, it cannot do de-ghosting. It's just basically putting the images together and then stitching them as a panorama. So if you do have to do that, when you create your HDR, make sure you turn off the auto settings so that the tone of all 3 images stays the same as how they were shot, and it'll get combined together in the panorama a little cleaner. So once I'm done with that, I hit merge, and it's going to create my panorama. I'm going to cancel that because I've already done it. And this is the panorama that it created. And I'm going to come into my develop module, and we're going to look at this. We're going to compare it to the panorama that I created last time. And so you can see that there's a lot more detail in this image because we've done this HDR panorama. In this upper area here, it's a little bit washed out in my normal, and in the panorama HDR, it's got a ton of detail and a little bit of sky tone color that's going on in there. We have just a beautiful range of tones on this. And so I think that the HDR panorama is really beneficial in this situation. I know it adds an extra step or steps to our shooting and our processing, but I think that it can be beneficial to have all of that information. In other words, the more information that I can start with, then the more I can get out of my image when I finally go in to process it. I mean, you can really see the difference in the leaves down here, where these have some bright highlights on them kind of happening. And the highlights here are all sort of quieted down, and there's just a lot more texture and a lot more detail. So it's not a very technical process because it sort of does all of the settings for you. But if you bracket your shots on your panoramas, you can combine them all together as an HDR panorama.